Hey everyone, this is Miss Lopez. Welcome to Ecological Communities, your notes for ecology in Unit 1. This is the second part. This is part 2. The key concepts we're going to go over for this video include the interaction between species and how that may increase, decrease, or have no effect on fitness. We're also going to look at interactions within and among species and how that affects population dynamics and species distributions. We are going to skip 4.3.3 for now. We'll come back to it later in December. And so the last thing we'll look at is how these interactions within and among the species can result in evolution. So the first thing we'll need to do is talk about the difference between interspecific and intraspecific competition. So interspecific, we're focusing on the E here. Interspecific interactions are between individuals of different species. And this affects each other's individual's life history and thus survival and reproduction, which in turn determines the individual's contribution to the total population growth rate. So what I've got here is an image showing various organisms sharing a common resource, which is the water. And in these organisms include the zebra, you can see some wildebeest here and some impala. And so they are all trying to compete for the same resource, limited resource, which is water. So the contribution to a population growth rate is a measure of an individual's fitness. These interactions may increase or decrease fitness of either individual. So think of fitness as how much an organism is able to survive and reproduce in a particular area. And when we look at fitness, there are 5 different categories for the way that these organisms are going to compete for the same resource. In other words, there's 5 categories of interspecific interactions. And so these are your major types of species interactions. You have competition, consumer resource, which includes predation, herbivory, parasitism, mutualism, commensalism, and amensalism. And you can see here that they give you a description on how each organism is affected. So the effect of species 1 and the effect of species 2, you'll notice for competition, both of them are negative. Both of them lose out. For consumer resource, you'll see that one organism benefits, the other one's harmed. Mutualism, and both of them benefit. Commensalism, one benefits, the other is unaffected. And then in amensalism, one is harmed while the other one is unaffected. So with your interspecific competition, that is where you have a negative interactions between 2 or more species that require the same resource. At any one time, there's often one limiting resource in the shortest supply relative to the demand. And species that share limiting resources are likely to compete. So the example that we went over, or that I showed you at the beginning, you had the deer, the wildebeest, and the zebras all fighting for that limited resource, which was water. But it could equally be just space to roam. It could be the grass itself. All of those are considered limiting resources. And anytime that there has to be sharing of those limited resources, there's competition. And that competition is divided into either interspecific, if they are different species, or intraspecific, which is the same species. But the important thing that you guys understand is that with competition, both species or both individuals are considered negative interactions. So let's take a look at some of these interactions. We're going to start by looking at consumer resource interactions. So again, one organism benefits, the other is harmed. And organisms that get their nutrition by eating other living organisms. The consumer benefits while the consumed organism, which is the resource, is going to lose. This includes things like predation, so you have predator-prey relationships, Herbivory, which is when an organism eats a plant. Remember that plants are living things. And so this organism here, this koala, is consuming another organism. And parasitism. Parasitism is where you have a host and a parasite, and the parasite is living off of the host. In mutualism, there is a positive interaction, and it takes on many forms and involves many kinds of organisms, and it just there's different levels of mutualism based on the relationship and whether one organism can survive without the other. So we have here a hummingbird that is drinking the nectar from plants, and the plants benefit because now the hummingbird will pollinate other plants of the same species, and the bird benefits because it's getting to drink the sugar water, the nectar, which is necessary for energy and survival of the bird. Commensalism is where you have one organism benefiting, the other unaffected interaction. In this case, what you have is this particular bird is riding on this larger cow thing. I think that's a cow. The bird benefits because as the cow is wandering through the grass, the cow is disturbing grasshoppers and insects that are hiding amongst the grass. So the bird is benefiting because it's going to eat up those insects. But the cow is really unaffected by this relationship. It's not gaining anything good. It's not losing anything. It's basically unaffected. The same thing can be found with bromeliads. Bromeliads are types of plants that live on trees, and they have inside their leaves here, they collect water. And that water is beneficial to spiders and insects that grow in those little pools. However, the plant itself is really unaffected by the spiders, the insects, the frogs, whatever that's living in this species. The growth rate of a community is not fixed because of intraspecific competition. In intraspecific competition, you have the same species that are competing for a specific resource. It's still competition, which means it's detrimental. In other words, both organisms are going to have negative consequences from this interaction. But the difference between intraspecific competition and interspecific is that it's the same species that's fighting for a resource. So in this picture here, you can see these two male deer are fighting, and they're fighting over a limited resource, which is females, which is mates. And so intraspecific competition is still competition. They're both going to lose out. But in this case, it's now the same species, not different species. Interspecific interactions can affect species distributions, and those competitive interactions can restrict the habitats in which species occur. So what I have here is another example of intraspecific competition. You'll see how this beach is jam-packed with these seals. And so the resource that they are fighting for is limited space. But not only can members of all the same species, like all these seals, not only can competition be intraspecific, it can be competition between other organisms as well. So because both organisms are going to be negatively affected, they have to find a way to share their resources. If they don't share, one of them is going to drive the other one to extinction. Okay, resource partitioning is the sharing. It's the different ways of using a resource and can be a mechanism for intraspecific competition to be stronger than interspecific competition. The differences in resources are sufficiently large, and competing species can coexist. So what you have here is an example of resource partitioning between different types of birds. And what they're showing you here is this area in yellow is the area in which these birds typically nest. So even though these birds are sharing or go after the same species of trees, the reason they can share it is because this particular bird typically is going to be found in these outer areas. This bird is going to be found including on the inside of the area. These birds tend to stay towards the top. These ones go the middle and below, and these ones are exclusively down below at the bottom. So these birds are able to share this type of tree and can coexist because of the way that they share. Typically, what happens when you see resource partitioning is you see that there is going to be some interlap of what the different species shares, but the organisms that are going to be successful, the one that have the highest fitness, are going to be the ones that can also include or consume, in this case, some other resources besides the one that is shared. Because this is such a limited amount, if these two species only had this area right here, their population wouldn't grow very big. They'd have a lot of trouble. They'd likely to go extinct. But by consuming different seed sizes, as shown here, the species B, if there's none of this seed side right here, they can eat this higher end, and species A can also eat smaller seeds as well to supplement what they would normally be eating in this interactive or in this common area. Invasive species are likely to have a negative effect on native species because they are competitive. They outcompete the organisms that are native. And so a great example of this is a lionfish. The lionfish was introduced into the Caribbean when Hurricane Andrew hit Florida, did a lot of devastation in Florida, including people's homes, destroying people's homes, and destroying aquariums inside people's homes. So people keep lionfish in saltwater aquariums because they're very beautiful to look at. However, when these lionfish escaped from the aquariums during this hurricane, they ended up in the waters of the Caribbean, and there they are able to kill and take away many of the native species' resources. And so that's a real problem in the Caribbean. This lionfish, which is normally from another sea, another ocean, was able to quickly adapt, loved having all this fresh new prey, loved the wonderful waters of the Caribbean. And so this invasive species has a negative effect, not only because it's taking those resources away from other fish, but it's also very aggressive. It's a predator. And so it's also eating a lot of native fish as well. And since the lionfish has no natural predators in the Caribbean, they're not normally from there, so there's no natural predators, the lionfish population was decimating the fish population of the Caribbean. Invasive species can harm native species in various ways. Invasive plants can physically crowd out native plant and alter the relationship between native plants and their pollinators. So what you see in this is an example of something called kudzu, which grows very well in the southeast United States. And so even though this looks green and lush, all of this right here is actually an invasive plant that's very hard to get rid of. And in this case, the kudzu is blocking out sunlight to all the plants that are covered underneath it. And those plants are being killed because they're not getting any of the normal amounts of sunshine they would normally get. Some invasive species can cause the extinction of native species. So here you have a python that was introduced into the Everglades in Florida. And now these pythons, which are thriving and reproducing successfully in Florida, are eating other species. In interspecific competition, even though it sounds like this might be a bad thing, over time, this interspecific competition can lead to the evolution of very specific interactions. So for example, this bird, you can tell by the shape of its beak, has evolved to get nectar only from this plant. And any other bird that tries to come in here and get nectar from it is not going to be able to. So even though interspecific competition does reduce resources, it can lead to the evolution of very unique adaptations or characteristics that evolve between one organism and another to make sure that these two now are exclusive and no other bird is going to be competing for the nectar at the bottom of this plant. Your consumer resource interaction. In your consumer resource interactions, the opposing interests of the consumer and the resource species can lead to that evolutionary arms race in which prey continually evolve better defenses and predators continually evolve better offenses. So think of something like plants, or not plants, of prey, deer, let's say deer. The ones that are able to outrun the predators are going to be the ones that survive, and then they pass out the genes for fast running or longer legs to their offspring. And so that's where you get this idea of the survival of the fittest. Whenever there's species, whenever you have organisms that are what we call the resource, the prey, in other words, they're able to evolve ways to hide or outrun or outmaneuver the predator. We already talked about speed. We also can use size. Think of like an elephant, very, very large size, as a way to deter predators from eating them. They can also have weapons. They can have, this is where you get into your colorations, your aposematic colorations, to tell predators, don't eat me. I can either harm you with like a porcupine needle, or I can harm you with a particular terrible smell. They can also hide or use camouflage. That's that cryptic coloration, which you see right here is this chameleon species, looks a lot like leaves. They can also have the mimicry to unpalatable species. So you can see here that these two types of butterflies are very, very similar. One of them is poisonous, one of them is not, and it's very hard to distinguish between the two. Or they could have thick armor, or they could be non-nutritive, or they can be poisonous, especially if they're sessile. In other words, if they don't move, if they don't have the ability to run away from predators, they've got to have something to protect them from being eaten. Plants produce a variety of toxic chemicals against herbivores and pathogens. Some of these chemicals we use as spices. For example, black pepper, chili peppers, that capsaicin, caffeine, all of these are poisons. Well, I don't want to say poisons, but they're chemicals that plants use to keep other organisms from eating them. And then herbivores will have a way to deal with the chemicals. So some of them can't taste the black pepper, or they can't taste the capsaicin in the peppers, or they're unaffected by the caffeine in the plants. With mutualism, one thing to remember is that species are benefiting because they're acting in their own self-interest to benefit themselves when they happen to be benefiting others. So it's not like the flower is sitting here and saying, oh, I'm going to help this poor cute little bee out because it's so hungry. The flower has an ulterior motive. It wants the bee to collect the pollen, and so it's going to lure it in with that sweet nectar and then hope that the bee is going to go visit another flower and spread the pollen over there. So the thing to remember from this is that these organisms are not doing it just because they want to feel good or because it's the right thing to do. They have an ulterior motive. They want some kind of benefit as well. All mutualisms involve the exchange of resources and services, and the fitness effect of mutualism can vary depending on the environmental conditions. In other words, how beneficial that relationship is varies depending on those environmental conditions. Mutualisms are diverse and complex. Some evolve into one-on-one relationships with even tighter reciprocal adaptation, such as you can see with the leafcutter ants and fungus. Basically, the leafcutter ants are able to farm a fungus by using the leaves. The ants are able to use the leaves as nutrition for the fungus, and the fungus grows. Now, there's still a very highly specific relationship between the ants and the fungus. The fungus benefits because the ants are bringing them food. The ants are benefiting. And what happens is that you end up with a very tight relationship between the two. Some have generalized adaptations. That's what you see between the plants and animals that disperse their seeds. So generalized means that it's very broad. Any animal can come and eat a fruit that will then hopefully get passed on somewhere else to spread the seed somewhere else, whereas some are very, very tight indeed, and these two cannot exist without the other. So what I'm going to look at on this slide are the different relationships, and I'm going to use these graphs to show what happens to these populations over time. Let's start with mutualism. In mutualism, you have here when the two are introduced. In other words, when the relationship begins. So you can see what the population of A is before and the population of B is before. Once that relationship happens, what you're going to see for the population size over time is, since they're both benefiting, both of the populations will increase. For commensalism, same scenario, you have population A and population B, but since this is commensalism, population A is unaffected. Population B is going to benefit once that relationship begins, and so you'll see its population begin to go up. The last graph is showing parasitism. So what you have here is population A and population B, and then after that relationship, B is going to increase and A stays the same. Remember that with parasitism, the parasite doesn't want to kill the host, okay? If you kill the host, then the parasite has nowhere to live. So with A, population should stay unaffected, but with B, your population should increase. Now for the one we saw here, last two, you are going to predict what these graphs are going to look like. You're going to predict a graph just like, you're going to predict what would it look like for competition, and then you're going to pick or draw a picture of a consumer resource, another predation or herbivory relationship interaction. I hope these videos were helpful to you guys. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you later. This concludes the end of Ecology for Unit 1.